Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining this conversation today. I'm really looking forward to sharing this one with you. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Our communication matters so much. The stories we tell, the messages that we share, the narratives that we pass on, it helps us decide what we value and what's okay and how we act. One way I see it is that we, as children, are communicated to. We internalize narratives and messages that are passed on to us. And then as we grow, we get to kind of question those and think about them more deeply and reflect on them and decide if that narrative that was passed on to us is what we want to pass on to others or to the next generation, if you will. Today we're talking to Burton Patterson, and this is just an important conversation, and I want to start off with letting you know that today's conversation contains mentions of sexual assault and gender-based violence. So if that is a conversation that is hard for you to listen to, I'll go ahead and encourage you to take a step back from this episode, but I really invite you to lean in, and I hope that you know you can trust Burton and I to navigate this conversation with compassion and curiosity. And so I invite you to lean in with us too, even if it feels uncomfortable or like uncharted territory for you. I think the only question I would ask you to keep in mind as we go into today's conversation is, what are the stories that have been passed on to you about gender? Gender and the ideas we have around it, and just talking about those are really important to his work and important to all of us. So let's jump in.
Hi, Burton. Thanks so much for being here today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I think it's a meaningful one, and I know that you have a great passion for it. And so I'm excited to hear your perspective and your insight for sure.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. I appreciate you reaching out and having me.
Well, to start, I was wondering if you could give us kind of a brief introduction to who you are. I know when we've talked before, it sounded like different stories from your childhood and the way that you grew up has really shaped the work you do, the way you interact with people in the world. And so I was just wondering if you might be able to share some of those stories that feel important to know who you are and maybe feel especially relevant to this conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go all the way back.
Please, yes.
I'll take it back. So I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. And we can get in a whole conversation about what the South Side of Chicago means and what it means to grow up in that environment. Because I feel like a lot of my lived experiences and the places that I've lived sort of shaped who I am today. So starting there, growing up on the South Side of Chicago, I was raised in a family where my father was a social worker by trade. And my mother was a medical technologist, so she worked in blood banks and really helped people. She worked to help improve the quality of people's lives and save people's lives. So I grew up in a family of helpers, and I always knew that no matter what I did with my life and my career, I also wanted to be a helper. I wanted to help people. At a young age, I was exposed to vulnerable populations. My father worked in the mental health field. And we were, as children, my brother, my sister, and I were exposed to folks who were struggling with mental health issues, with homelessness. And my father would bring us around and expose us to them, and we'd become friends with them, and we would just see people as people. And I think that was a big part of my early upbringing, is seeing people for themselves and treating people how we wanted to be treated. And that shaped who I saw myself becoming as a professional. So I went to undergrad and I got a bachelor's in social work with a minor in psychology. I knew that I wanted to do something in the helping for profession, so I decided to go into the mental health field myself. So after graduating from college, I worked in the mental health and addiction field, and I did that for about 7 years in Chicago. And some of the people that I met truly changed my life, hearing their stories, hearing what they had been through, hearing where they are now. And I was on the intervention side of things. I was helping them after they experienced some form of trauma throughout their lives. And I saw that, and seeing that and really taking that on as a caseworker, as a certified alcohol and drug counselor, I saw what trauma led people to, and sort of seeing that path that they were going down. I wanted to get out in front of that. I wanted to prevent trauma from happening to folks. So I wanted to be on the prevention side of things. So I did that for about 7 years, and I have tons of stories of, I could probably write a book of all the things that I saw while being in a residential facility, working with folks struggling with those things. It was challenging. It was very challenging to do that work because it can quickly burn you out if you're someone like me, and I consider myself an empath. So
Yeah.
I hold a lot of that stuff inside. I internalize that. So I was heading towards the burnout phase, and I was like, okay, I can't do this. It's not fair to the people I work with. It's not fair to me. It's not fair to my family. So that's when I decided to do more prevention work. So I went from there, and I started doing bullying prevention. So I talked to youth kindergarten through 10th grade all around the state of Indiana about bullying prevention. We talked about, what does bullying look like? How can we prevent it in schools? And it was awesome. It was awesome to have these conversations. It was awesome to be in the schools with the youth. Super insightful. They had some great responses to how we can sort of change that bullying culture.
Mm.
And it was meaningful work, and I truly enjoyed it for the few years that I did it. And then I wanted something a little bit deeper. So I found sexual assault prevention. I never saw myself being in that field. I never considered myself a preventionist. But once I was introduced to the sexual assault prevention field, it just sort of, it just caught me. It really felt like my calling. And while I was in the sexual assault prevention field, I learned so much about gender-based violence, about how I could use my voice as a man, and use that platform and use that privilege, for lack of a better word, because male privilege is a real thing.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of males don't tap into that in a positive way. Like, a lot of males use that privilege for self-gain, for selfish reasons. So I saw myself using that in a positive way, and sort of reaching out to college-age folks and having that conversation with them about, how can we change the sexual assault prevention? How can we change the sexual assault culture? How can we change rape culture? How can we, as men, use our voices to call in other men, male identifying folks? How can we use our voices in that positive way? So my professional career has sort of been this arc of seeing what trauma did to folks, to the prevention side of things of, let's prevent those traumas from ever happening to people, so no one has to suffer from those consequences.
Absolutely. I'm curious, growing up, what were the messages or norms that you saw around gender? Like, when you started working in sexual assault prevention and learning about masculinity and seeing those patterns, was that the first time that you were seeing, oh, this is what maybe a positive version of masculinity could be? Or was that something that you were seeing from a younger age? You maybe just didn't know what to call it.
Yeah, no, I was very much, I considered myself, and I mean, I still do, but at the time I considered myself like the quote unquote good guy that, respected every gender and did my part and didn't hurt people. And then I learned about it, and I learned that we all add to that culture, especially men. And there was more that I could have been doing. So I think, to answer your question, at an early age, specifically because I identify as Black male, those are my identities. In the Black culture, masculinity is unique, as it is in any culture. And there are very defined gender roles. And growing up, I saw those gender roles, and, I saw what it meant to be a man. I was getting those messages from home, from media, from peers. There were defined gender roles. And I think oftentimes in many generations, we are taught those defined gender roles of what it means to be a man, how we're socialized to be men, to be the provider, to be the protector, to be the breadwinner, all of those sort of rigid ideals were ingrained in me. So I grew up thinking those things, and I'm not a closed-minded person, but I think until I hit like my mid-20s, I believed those things because those were the messages that were being reinforced to me. And media played a big part in that too, of what it means to be a man. And then, you know, as I got older and as I educated myself and as I started to learn more, I sort of saw what it meant to truly redefine those gender norms and gender roles.
Yeah, so you must have done some real big reflecting and unpacking there. I know I think that's such an important, you know, I know there's a life unexamined is not worth living, or, you know, whatever that quote may be, but I just think reflection's so important. And, you know, part of what we like to talk about around this podcast is that it's helpful to see patterns. And maybe you saw some of those patterns of what gender meant to people, what roles people had based on their gender, what these expectations were, and there was a reflection needed there, and you saw those patterns, and then importantly were able to make changes about those patterns. And that's just making me think that three of the very central questions to that we ask, which is part of a reflecting process, is how did that get made? What are we making now? And what can we do to make better social worlds? And I see those three questions as being important, and important that you ask all three together. You know, it's not just let me look back and take stock of what I've learned, but am I still carrying on what I've learned? And reframing it maybe as a choice, because like you said, you couldn't know what you didn't know until you were in your mid-20s and maybe started hearing other messages. If you only heard one message, that's the message you internalize. How could you, you know anything different? So you maybe almost take it for granted that you have a choice in the patterns you create and in the ways you are in the world. And so it's cool to see that kind of, to me, very, you know, obvious example of you saying, okay, well, how did this get made? How did these ideas about gender get made for me in my life? But maybe also you're looking at it on a much bigger scale in society. And then, you know, with the work you're doing now, what are we making now? What are the narratives we're making now? What are the things we're passing on? And how is all of that part of making choices that help us make an even better social world down the line in terms of what that conversation looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I look back too, I think about a lot of the interactions I had with peers, with other male identifying folks throughout my life. And a big piece of it was the objectification part of how women were objectified, and the conversations that would take place in different social groups. And it wasn't just like one set of friends. It was like across the board, women were being objectified and seeing as objects. And it was in the dialogue, it was in the intentional conversation. And I look back at that, and obviously I didn't know, I know now, but had I had that knowledge then, I could have interjected some of that into those conversations and sort of been that person who was calling people in and saying, we shouldn't be talking about people like that. We shouldn't be viewing people like that. So my goal was always to sort of be that igniter for folks. So have that conversation with people, so then they can go back to their groups and that ripple effect can take place. So if I meet with a group of college age men and there's 30 of them in the group, and the light bulb goes off for 3 of them, and those 3 go back to their groups and there's a conversation happening and it's harmful or it's hurtful, and then they can say something like, you know, we shouldn't be talking about people that way. We shouldn't be viewing people that way. That's sort of the basis of the work that I've done throughout my career, is I have to believe that that ripple effect is taking place, that someone's mind is changing in that moment, someone's ideals are changing, and then they can spread that to other people. So I think that sort of touches on a piece of your 3 questions of how are we changing this? That's the hope, right? Like, be the change, as cliche as that sounds, like be the change that you want to see in the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's the core of it, is that we have choices and that we actually are, you know, actively participating in the worlds that we live in, the societies, the cultures that we're a part of. And so in order to think that you can be the change, you have to believe that you have those choices and that power first. And so I see that as being, you know, part of the work that you're doing of, asking people to question things that they've maybe never questioned and think in new ways. And that, I imagine, can be really challenging for people, but really important too.
Absolutely.
Now that you've shared a little bit about your own stories that you had around gender or different things in your life and the path that you've been on, can you speak to a little bit of what are those stories that we see in our culture, at least in the United States, around like sexual assault and gender-based violence? Because I think maybe some people, like you were saying for the first part of your life, could kind of take for granted or just not recognize maybe the stories that they've internalized because maybe, someone's never experienced assault or harassment, don't think that they know anyone that has, and maybe they feel kind of distant from those narratives. But I think even the larger societal narratives, like there's no escaping that. Almost we maybe internalize that whether we know it or not. So I was just wondering if you could kind of name some of those maybe more subtle stories that we find ourselves internalizing.
I think one of the biggest stigmas is that it's a women's issue. And that in our society we place a lot of the onus on the survivor or the victim. And we start the line of victim blaming questions. Why did you do that? Why were you there? Why did you dress that way? How could you have prevented what happened to you? And I always stop right there. Like, it is never, ever, ever, ever the survivor's fault. It is not their fault in any way. It is 100% on the perpetrator. It is on the person who committed those actions. And that is where the onus needs to be in our society. Why did the perpetrator do what they did? Why did that take place? What led them to making those decisions? So it's not a women's issue. It's not something that we need to focus on other genders saying, we're going to equip you with the tools. This is true. We do need to equip everyone with the tools of how to stay safe, but also we need to focus on perpetrators. And I think in our society, we don't do that enough. We don't focus on changing the behaviors and the patterns of perpetrators and sort of rehabilitating them in a way that makes our society safe. And I think I always tell folks, start by believing survivors, even if a story is far-fetched or it seems to you that the instances aren't congruent and they don't really make sense. That's how their brain is remembering it. That's how their trauma brain is putting the pieces back together. So don't always automatically assume because someone's story doesn't make sense to you that they are telling a lie or they're false reporting. Oftentimes in the circles that I'm in when I'm talking to men, false reporting comes up. And I always want to make it very clear to folks that false reporting is very, 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 very small fraction of the reports that actually do come out. The people who are brave enough to actually report an assault happening, they're not false reporting it. The statistics show that it's under 4% of people who are actually false reporting something happening. So I think all of those things are stories that our society and the media like to sort of put out there. But we need to be very clear that those are not the standards of what's really happening. I think too, one of the things that I often talk to the folks that I work with about is what we can do to be an ally and what it looks like to be an ally. One of the things that being a good ally means is utilizing space and not taking space. So being there to support, being there standing up with, but not being the focus of the movement or of the issue, because women have been fighting this fight for hundreds of years and they continue to fight this fight. We need men to move the movement forward, but we don't need men taking that light and standing in the front and saying, look at me, like the shiny object. Look at me, I'm helping, I'm a guy, I'm using my voice. Be an ally in a way that you're not occupying the space that is not always meant for us to take.
Yeah, there's definitely some really important nuances there and that's maybe what, I don't know, turns people away or makes it feel challenging to lean into these kind of conversations, because it's something you probably have to figure out as you go and navigate and understand that you might say the wrong thing and you might, accidentally center yourself, and you have to keep going after that, and not think that you're going in, never going to make any mistake. Yeah. The other thing that was coming up in my head as you're talking is that context is just so important. And I think part of the story that we have around instances of sexual assault is viewing them as individual instances or episodes. And that's part of what probably keeps us from taking real action around the larger systems that perpetuate, a toxic masculinity, a rape culture, and continued gender-based violence, is that we're looking at it as like an individual episode or event instead of, well, it's not this one man or this one person decided to take this action. It's this person decided to take this action based on the society that they also live in and these messages that they've internalized that says this is acceptable, or this is the value of this person, or this is what you're allowed to do as your gender.
100%. I think, well, I know that assault is about power and control, right? It's not about specific instance, as you reference. It's about the power and control of another person. And a lot of the time it's baked with entitlement and thinking that someone is an object or they belong to you, or you are entitled to their body. All of those things are baked into that power and control. And that's a societal problem. It's not, like you said, it's not a specific instance, but it's societal. It's what we embed in the minds of young boys and young men to dominate other genders. And we teach that to them at a very early age, and then it becomes more and more problematic. I often think about I have an 8-year-old son, and I think about my son and how affectionate he is and how he loves to hold hands and hug. And he's just a very affectionate young boy. And I think in our society, we teach young boys specifically about homophobia. And we say that as you get older, you can't show affection to other boys or other men because then you are seen as gay. And in this society, gay is seen as weaker. And I can talk about the whole man box and what that looks like to be inside of the man box. And there are all of these really harmful traits that keep people squarely inside that man box. And as boys and young men, it's important for us to be inside that man box because that means that we're accepted by our peers, and that means that we're accepted in social circles. And to step outside of that man box is very harmful to us because we are ostracized. Peers don't respect us in the same way. And I think for anyone, any gender, we are all trying to be accepted by our peers in a certain way. And this society's ideal of the man box and how we are kept inside of it is gender policing, and saying that you're weak for this, or using very derogatory terms to keep people inside of that man box and to keep them wanting their peers' approval for certain things. And as boys grow up, they can't have those relationships with other men. And you see that often with mental health issues for men when they grow up and not reaching out for professional services, not seeking psychiatrists, not going to therapy, not being medicated. And all of those things lead to violence in our society. It leads to school shootings. It leads to a lot of the violence that's done against other genders. All of that is baked into the way we socialize our boys in this society. And it's a huge problem. It's a huge ongoing problem that we are consistently fighting against.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the man box because that's reminding me. I don't know if you ever interacted with this person when you were at Ball State, but one of my very early conversations on this podcast was with Robbie Williford, and he mentioned the man box activity in our conversation because that was really meaningful for him. And he's someone that I think is definitely very driven to, invite everyone of all genders, but especially men into a space where they can, step outside of that man box and start asking questions and different things. Is there anything else you'd want to say about the man box? Or I know there's, activities that go with that too, and maybe how that's part of how you invite men into this conversation that is probably generally seen as not their business or not something they need to worry about.
So the man box sort of took over for the man card, which was very popular in the 90s and early 2000s. It was, again, gender policing, how you would get your man card revoked. If you did something that did not align with the values of what it traditionally means to be a man, your man card would be revoked. So you could do anything and someone would check your masculinity by saying, we're revoking your man card. Very similar idea with the man box. If you do something that does not align I think the traditional ideals of what it means to be a man is sort of what we talked about: aggressive, heterosexual, provider, protector. You have to objectify women. You have to be dominant. You have to be aggressive. You usually need to be physically dominant in some type of sport or athletic arena. And all of those things are sort of the ideals of what it means to be a quote unquote real man.
You're right.
And if you stray from that at all, your masculinity will be in question.
Yeah.
Your sexuality will be in question. And that brings people right back. So they start to question themselves. And it's very harmful, but it is sort of the basis of the foundation of what it means to be a man in this society. And some of the activities, like you mentioned, that go with that it's all about its internal work. And I encourage anyone to research the man box and to look up those activities, because that's truly where the internal work starts. And that's the hardest piece. I'm not going to lie and pretend like that's an easy thing to do. But when you really start looking into sort of your values and what you believe and things that you can do differently, that's when the work begins. And it's really eye-opening too, because like I said, I always considered myself a good person and a good man. And I was like, I don't do those things. I'm not harmful at all.
Yeah.
And then as I started to internalize and sort of do that inner work, I realized there are things that I can change about the way I interact with people and the way that I talk about people and the way that I call people in and not call people out. There are all these things that come with that internal work. And I think that's really important for folks who want to sort of change that gender-based violence, the narrative, and change rape culture and shift how we view different genders in our society.
Can you talk a little bit more about that difference between calling people in versus calling them out?
Yeah, so that's something I learned as well, because this is going to sound a little funny, but because men have such, for lack of a better word, soft egos, it can be very challenging to call out behavior. We have fragile masculinity is a very real thing. When you start talking about healthy and toxic masculinity, it can turn a lot of people off. And a lot of boys and young men can put up a wall immediately when you start talking about things like that. So calling in is different than calling out, because when you're calling out people, for example, if you're in a group and someone says something that is objectifying a woman, like, I'm going to hit that tonight. If they say something along those lines, calling out would be in front of the group. Don't say that. That's terrible. You're a terrible person. Don't ever say that. Calling in would be something along the lines of pulling them to the side and saying, this is why that can be hurtful to view people that way. It's sort of a softer approach.
Yeah.
And it's not as abrupt as calling someone out, and it's not as othering, I should say. It doesn't automatically say that you're a terrible person and you're doing awful things. More so, how can we reframe that approach? How can we look at that differently? So I learned that early on in my career, because I was very much someone who was like considering themselves an activist, and I would be like, no, that's wrong, don't do that. And that's not always the best approach for folks, especially when you're talking about masculinity, because it's a sensitive topic for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's good. I'm trying to think of other examples. I think that calling in is so important because that's an invitation. Whereas, calling someone out is probably immediately sending them into a state of defensiveness. And so I think everybody needs to bring, like, curiosity is probably the key tool to have with you as you're going into these conversations, because maybe even a version of calling out is saying, that's sexist, don't say that, like you were saying, but maybe a calling in is, why do you say it like that? Or why do you have that, asking a question, getting people to think about things that, again, they may never have thought about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they don't know any other way.
Yeah. And I often tell people too, because I'm a gamer, so I play Xbox, and it is it's a toxic world of folks and the language that's used. But, like in the spaces that I'm in, they are mostly dominated by males, and I get sort of lose my energy for being that quote unquote that person that is always the one that's like, let's not do that or let's not say that. So I have to be very intentional with my words and intentional with my timing, and intentional with calling people in. And oftentimes I tell people, if you're not comfortable having that conversation, if you're not comfortable calling someone in, put the onus on yourself. So you can say, that makes me uncomfortable. When you say that around me, that makes me really uncomfortable. Do you mind not doing that? It's more so about the way that it makes you feel and less so about the words that that person is choosing to say. So even in that moment, if they continue that language in another circle or they continue using that language somewhere else, when they're around you, they're actively thinking about what you said. The hope is that they internalize that and they think, okay, I won't use that language around this person because they asked me not to. And then the hope is that the next time they go to use that language, they're also thinking about that interaction with you in the back of their mind of, someone asked me not to do that because it hurt their feelings. Maybe it's hurting someone else. So there are intentional ways to go about calling people in, and there are very useful tactics for doing that. And that can bring about change too.
I think that's really helpful to have like a third way, because between maybe, you know, saying nothing and starting a big dialogue, because maybe not every moment feels like it's the moment for that. Or, you know, people who have never had these conversations before, we can't pretend like it's easy to just call people in. You know, it's not that. And so, but yeah, that for reframing of maybe it's not the moment, or maybe you don't feel equipped, or you're still learning how to say, hey, this is a part of a much bigger problem that you're helping perpetuate. Let's be curious. Let's talk about this. Let's try to unpack some of these things, to say that makes me uncomfortable. And yeah, the answer, it's like you were talking about the ripple effects of just saying that the one comment could be a ripple effect, but on, you know, the opposite side of the coin, not saying anything has its own ripples too, of not saying anything and not saying anything and not saying anything, and other people not saying anything because they don't think they have to say anything. And so it's like you're causing ripples either way. I'm curious, what like advice, I guess, would you have, or other tools maybe? Because I'm sure some people could be listening and still thinking, oh, that still feels so impossible. I don't want to say nothing, but those don't feel like realistic options, or I wouldn't even know where to begin with that. So what kind of like advice or tools could you give to people who want to have these kind of conversations, but maybe feel overwhelmed by them?
I think, and I always start any advice I give with educating yourself. There are some great, I always recommend Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. If you are thinking about how you can shape those conversations or what those conversations can be like, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an open letter to his son, and he explains the world and what he wants the world to look like for him. And there are some really great, insightful nuggets in there that can help you understand what it means to have those conversations in a meaningful way. And I feel like the book is very empowering for folks who are just starting the conversations of gender-based violence prevention, rape culture, healthy masculinity. Start with educating yourself. Find tools, find resources. You know, in the age that we live in now, we have all of the education at our fingertips. We can find whatever we need to find. Educate yourself on what the issues are. If you're trying to call someone in and you're not sure, I say start there. Start with educating yourself. And once you have those tools, once you feel equipped, that's going to make anybody feel more comfortable having that conversation. But it has to feel right for you. And that's a nuance in itself. It has to feel like the right moment. You have to be comfortable enough with that person. Calling out complete strangers is something that not many people can really do or really should do, because, you know, people are going to be defensive immediately when they don't know you and they don't know your intentions. So the more you know someone, the easier it is to have that conversation with them. So make sure that it's the right moment. Make sure that you have an established relationship with that person before you can get into like this deep conversation with them about what it means to reshape their actions or reframe their ideals. And then always, I tell people all the time, there's always strength in numbers. So
Mhm.
there might be other folks in the group who feel the way that you do. And sometimes stepping up and speaking out, those other people feel empowered too. So they might feel the same way that you do, and they might join that conversation, and they might support the cause that you are sort of bringing up. And that's always a helpful moment too, is having that strength in numbers.
Okay, that's all for part 1 with Burton. But next week you can come back and join us for a part 2. I think this is, again, a really meaningful conversation. Maybe it feels heavy. Maybe it feels like there's still a lot to think about for you. So I'd encourage you to take the next week until you join us for part 2 and keep reflecting on the things we talked about. What does it mean to you in your own individual contexts and life? And like I asked at the top of the episode, what are the stories that you do have around gender? And maybe now that you've gotten to be a part of this conversation with Burton and I, what are the new stories that you want to keep creating around gender? How can you approach those with curiosity and be a part of creating a more equal, equitable, just world for all genders through our communication, which again is such a powerful tool in any matter. But I think this one is especially a helpful one to take a communication perspective on. So again, be thinking about what you learned today and how it made you feel and what thoughts and ideas you had. And join us next week for part 2. As always, I want to shout out the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution for supporting the work of this podcast and being the people that gave me the language to understand just how important communication is to the creation of our social worlds and the power that it has, and helping me to share that message with all of you. To use the language of the CMM theory, I want to talk about next turns. We've had a great conversation today. We've been present to it. And now where do we go from here? What's the next turn? Some podcast next turns, of course, is that I'd love for you to follow the show wherever you listen. I have new episodes every Monday, so that way you'll be able to catch up with those. Also, if you can leave a review or a rating wherever you listen, that's very helpful to me, and I appreciate you taking the time to do that. But most of all, I think I would appreciate you sharing an episode with someone. And I just am excited to keep bringing more people into this conversation. Maybe I'll specifically ask you to reflect on the conversation today and who in your life you want to hear this episode and be a part of this conversation with you. And of course, you can reach out to me, as I love to keep the dialogue going with you through email, on the website, or on Instagram and YouTube, which you can find links to in the description below. Thank you, of course, for showing up today. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.